second session, session 3, and the final one of the day, we're going to be talking about how you move from outcomes to specific teaching strategies. And for me, this is where the most fun happens in teaching, where you get a chance to be creative in figuring out what kinds of things students can do that will help them remember the most important parts and will give them an opportunity to feel challenged. And borrowing from Carol Dweck, to reinforce that you want them to adopt a growth mindset, that you want to help them learn to get excited about learning. All right, so what we're going to remind you of, we started with assessment strategies, a brief description in the last section. We are going to emphasize active learning and authentic assessment. We're striving to make things memorable and transformative, but that third bullet is, I hope that's not a surprise for you, but once you embark on an assessment way of life, you sort of get used to the idea that things don't settle down, because when you implement something in the classroom and you get data, the data can tell you what kinds of things worked and what kinds of things didn't work, and chances are good there's room for improvement in almost everything we do. And so it gives you a chance to recycle, start again, refine, redo instructions, get some feedback from students. And a mentor of mine said, you know, once I figured out that assessment never settles down, I was a lot happier. So it isn't just producing an end product, but adopting assessment as a strategic way of life. So what we're going to do is we're going to proceed through the outcomes of the IPI with some of my favorite examples, some that I've developed and some that I'm flat out stealing with credit for the people that exposed the strategy to me. And then we'll be asking you to do some similar sharing, bragging about things that work for you in the class to see how you think those fit with IPI, what kinds of things connect best with them. Well, let's start with one of my absolute favorite things. This comes from high school. I guess Steve is retiring, which is a crime for high school psychology. Steve Jones developed the zombie restaurant. And I'm using that to identify basic concepts and research findings. Well, I heard him talk about this at a conference, and I thought, that's just weird. And then I tried it, and the students were never more enthusiastic about a project than this. Basically, you put them in teams. You say you're now restaurant managers, but your clientele are zombies. And you have to develop dishes that would appeal to zombies. And when zombies eat body parts, the functions of those body parts transfer to the zombies. Well, I don't know if it's the popularity of zombies or what, but very quickly, if you give students paper and pencil, they develop menus, they develop slogans, they develop names for the zombie restaurant. And usually when I do this exercise, one of the things I do is I tape up their productions in a hallway so that people can admire what they've done because they're just that entertaining. So Steve requires that they do 7 dishes. I'm not quite that extravagant. I don't have that much time to spend on the project, but it's a great way to help them feel friendlier toward the content that most students regard as the hardest in introductory psychology, which is the biological side. It makes a difference in the approachability of the content, and students especially seem to enjoy that. But while I was preparing for this presentation, I did run across this image from the internet, and I just felt like I had to share it. That somebody figured out Maslow's hierarchy in relation to zombies. I just couldn't resist putting it in. So if you're a zombie and you self-actualize, you wander about aimlessly. If you have self-esteem, it means you consume more bodies than your neighbors, and so on and so forth. I especially like the physiological need is needs brains. Well, students love that activity. Next, if we move on to 1.2, we're talking about identifying basic concepts and research findings. And truly, one of the things that we've discovered in Guidelines 3.0 is that we haven't really given students enough statistical expectation in their undergraduate careers. But I think that statistical expectation can start in intro when we can teach some basic descriptive statistics to help them interpret the mountain of news and research studies that they read about or hear about. And so giving them graphs and having them talk about the statistics of the graphs, or having them launch from the graphs to look at what kinds of persuasion tactics might be necessary to get people to try a corona vaccine. Can they envision what kinds of factors might be going into people developing a hard and fast position? You simply pick a challenging research finding and then ask students to brainstorm in all directions about it. I've often referred to that as, it's a little militaristic, but I've referred to it as concept bombing. Here's the stimulus. Now take all of your psychology concepts and try to break it open. How much of it is relevant? Does that work? Does that work? So it's a good way to practice hypothesis testing. Apply psychological principles to personal and other aspects of everyday life. Kevin Clark, this project is listed in project assessment, and I think it comes complete with rubric, is a way to do a final exam in a class that you ask students to identify the things that were most meaningful for them. And if your students are like mine, when you're asking them to do reflective writing about things that have value for them, they can be pretty darn good writers. Now that changes once we start asking them to adopt a science voice and start to learn APA format and that sort of thing. But simply saying, here's the book, here's the material, find the 10 things that are most meaningful. And in the act of writing about that, chances are good those are the things that long-term they're going to remember the most. Moving on to research. Describe the advantages and limitations of research strategies. Well, this particular IPI outcome helped me on my home campus because we decided, based on some assessment data, that we weren't happy with our obligation to do problem solving. And so we decided to redesign the assessment approach that we were using. And here's the problem situation we decided. Students are well aware that not every student buys textbooks for a variety of reasons. But the fact is, we can use different methods to break open why that is. So by setting up the problem, students aren't buying their textbooks. What could we learn using a case study method, and what's the limitation of that? What could we learn from a survey, the advantages and limitations of that approach? And what could we learn from an experiment? And depending upon how fancy your design is, you can build in all kinds of related content assessment. Because our assessments at UWF must be administered across the 7 or 8 sections that we run, we also recognize that now what we're trying to do is standardize the research methods content so that all students have the same access to OER treatment of research methods, which gives us a much better measure of student understanding of research methods. We do know, fortunately, the IPI reinforces the belief we hold in our department that research methods is the most important content in intro. And even when you're picking from 2 from each pillar, you can't forget that at the bottom of that architecture is research foundation. Research foundation is really important. And that's why so many of these outcomes are dedicated to helping students understand what's the value of thinking like a psychological scientist. Evaluate, design, or conduct psychological research. If you have the luxury of doing research, that's lucky for you. That can be really complicated with IRB clearance and other kinds of complications that make it not all that attractive to try to do original research in introductory psych. But if you happen to teach psych in a 2-semester sequence, or if in particular you believe research foundations is important, it's not a bad idea to have students design a study that would answer a question. And so I find it most helpful to pick topics that they care about. So loneliness is huge. Intro students are, for the most part, adjusting to life as a college student. And this is especially exaggerated now because of what happened with COVID, that we're starting to get students who missed a lot of socializing to get them ready for the college environment. So can we pick things that matter to them? Can we ask them to come up with some policies about faculty rigidity in deadlines? How could we survey faculty to find out what faculty want to do? We can ask students to take on the problem of parking, because it's the worst problem of all for students, no matter where you are. Even if it means students have to walk an extra 2 minutes to get to class, parking always registers high. So find out the kinds of things that they care about and then encourage them to design studies. Now, I think the secret, and I alluded to this in the last session, is that students, because of where they are in cognitive development, it's sometimes referred to that they're dualistic thinkers, meaning they like to think in clear black and white terms. And so for them, anything that's in print means that some authority has said it's okay and therefore shouldn't be challenged, which doesn't set you up very well to do critical thinking of any kind. And so you may have to come up with some designs that are really problematic. One of the experiences I try out, which is sobering, is I haul out what I did for my dissertation. And I say, here's my problem. I wanted to find out if, was there anything we could do to fix postpartum depression? Was there anything we could do to reduce mothers' distress after having a child? Now, what would we have to, if we wanted to do an experiment on that, what would we have to take into account? And then open the class for, let's talk about all the different factors that would have to go into this, demand characteristics, for example. And how about random assignment to conditions, and what should the conditions be? In one of the years I did this, students came up with problems that I hadn't even come up with in my dissertation. But the fact that you're asking them to take on the responsibility to be critical is very empowering. And we hope that that's a stance that carries over into the rest of their academic career. Draw logical and objective conclusions about behavior from empirical evidence. This is also an example that's taken from a really talented, amazing woman, Maria Vida, a high school teacher, who came up with, I think this is also in project assessment, that you ask students to serve as a consultant to someone who's having multiple problems, especially not passing psychology and having sleep problems and bad study habits, and what kinds of advice could you come up with that could be empirically supported? That can make for a nice essay. It can make for a group discussion. The idea is that you get experience applying empirical findings, and also gives you a chance to challenge the kinds of alternatives that people come up with out of their own experience. So if they're saying, well, you know, what worked for me was, well, is that empirical? Can you go back to what scientists have found works for the general population, not just what works for you? And it gives you a really good opportunity to challenge in a way that's not embarrassing or humiliating. Well, here's one of my favorites, and it is one that I designed, and it is on project assessment. One measure that I was astounded to see how popular it was, not just from students, but when we turned it in our assessment report, the people who reviewed our assessment report were so taken with it that they wanted to take the assessment as well to see how they did. That's pretty powerful impact for stakeholders that don't have a huge stake in what's going on. But basically what you do is construct some of the multiple choice, true, false, strength of belief questionnaire on how much do you believe in ghosts? How much do you believe in learning styles influencing how well you can learn? How much do you believe schizophrenia involves multiple personalities? All the kind of stuff that students come into class with because they've just watched too much Dr. Phil, or too many soap operas, or things where people are misrepresenting what we do. In the first day of class, you do a measure to see what their strength of belief is on those outcomes. And then on the last day of class, you do it again. And you should see a shift in their skepticism in the healthy direction that we want it to go. Now, I won't say that you're able to talk people out of believing in astrology. We know from the literature on misconceptions that really takes a lot of work to be able to help people kind of gravitate towards some of the pseudoscience truths that psychologists hold dear. But to be able to see students say, well, I used to believe this strongly, now I'm not so sure, is a really good example of them grappling with the misconceptions and arriving at a new place. So that test, I believe, is available for downloading from Project Assessment. Now let's move to the themes. In the integrating themes, as Regan suggested, it's probably not a good idea. Maybe it was Garth. It's probably not a good idea to say, oh, I'm gonna make sure I touch on all these themes and really hammer them home. You can, but I think my advice is try to think about the themes that resonate most with you and figure out ways that you can come back to those themes as you progress through Research Foundations and through the 2 selections from the pillars, whatever the 2 selections are that fit with your values and goals. And highlight again, once again, here we have an example of this theme. In the end, you have an opportunity then to craft a very interesting final exam, and credit to Bridget Martin Hard. This is her exam. What big ideas were most meaningful to you? And because you're tapping meaning directly, chances are good that has the best shot at being transformative and being memorable. So for item A, psych science relies on empirical evidence and adapts as new data develops. Dualistic thinkers don't want things to change. They're happy when things are in print. They're going to trust that that is the truth. And in psychology, we know we have to revise what we think. Let me go back to the idea of learning styles. I'm embarrassed to say that because I didn't do a good job of being a scientific critical thinker, when learning styles hit the market in a big way, I incorporated that into a textbook that I wrote. And now I think, well, what was I thinking? What we know from empirical evidence is this is a concept that is really flourishing in colleges of education and in education courses, but there's no empirical evidence that suggests it's going to be useful, that will create better learning conditions if you pitch the learning style, the teaching style to the learning style. Students really, I think David Myers said, this is the weed that grows in the garden of psychology. It's really hard to get rid of. But I think if we, especially in the beginning where we're talking about why we're so enthused, maybe even maniacal about psychology as a science, that it's important to reflect the tenets of science involves public discussion, being open to being challenged about your conclusions, looking at alternative evidence, and if the evidence warrants it, changing your mind about what is truth. And so I think you can pick almost any phenomenon where there's been that kind of migration to be able to help students understand. We'll be happy to change our minds when the evidence is there. So being able to predict personalities from, you take any tabloid treatment, whatever the latest thing was. What did I hear last week on the news? Something about the type of movie you pick determines your personality. It's like, oh, really? Let me see the data on that. I don't buy it. Mental health treatments. The things that we used to think were helpful for people, putting them in spinny chairs and doing exorcism and treating them with suggestions that arise from the bumps and dents in their skulls. We know now that those are goofy. Some of the things that we believe in today in 20 years may also turn out to be goofy. And I think it's helpful if we leave ourselves an escape hatch. This is what we know today. This is the evolution of the science as it is today. One of my favorite examples is stress-induced ulcers. You may remember there was a classic experiment done that's now, I think, no longer reported in introductory texts called the executive monkey experiment, where Monkeys were yoked, and one monkey was given the responsibility of shock avoidance, and the other one was just along for the ride. And the one in the executive position developed ulcers, and the other one didn't. And unfortunately, maybe fortunately, that didn't replicate. And it turns out that ulcers actually have a biological component as opposed to necessarily stress. Stress can aggravate ulcers, but probably it doesn't cause them. And so being able to revisit those circumstances helps students understand the nature of science. Runner's high is also another controversial topic. 20 years ago, it was a given that people experience runner's high if they were dedicated marathoners, until some dedicated marathoner said, I don't experience that. And then research started, and that produced questionable outcomes. A more recent example that tripped up someone in a popular TED Talk was a discussion of the power pose. The power pose, for those of you who know what it is, I guess I could demonstrate this. You'll see me from the waist down is this. So that before I have a test, or before I have a conflict situation that I'm going to, if I adopt the power pose, it will generate more energy and positive force in me, and I'll be more successful. Well, the claims for that approach a little bit overblown, and that was exposed by empirical evidence. So helping students understand, just because somebody's trying to sell you an idea doesn't mean that you necessarily accept it, that you need to be able to say, what's your evidence? And has the evidence changed over time? And not to be defensive if in fact the evidence changes. Okay, so B is a little tricky because inevitably you're going to find students who, when you present a general principle, say, well, that doesn't apply to me. That's not, I mean, learning style is a good example. That doesn't apply to me. I'm clearly a kinesthetic learner. I work much better kinesthetically. Well, for that individual student, it could be true. I have my suspicions that it's probably more placebo effect than real effect. But the point is that in psychology, the traditions of psychology have been trying to establish what's most important for as a general rule. And when we're measuring individuals, we recognize that things distribute normally in some situations. And in some cases, we're going to see individual differences emerge even then. So probably one of my favorite examples of that is when we have the opportunity to use probe strips to demonstrate taste sensitivity. You pass those strips out, you explain, just looking for your reaction. And then of course you have a third of the class that looks like they're about to toss lunch because the taste is so bad. And the other students are going, what's your problem? Because they don't have a super taster tongue structure. That's a really interesting way to talk about individual differences. We can talk about individual differences as well in IQ development, in Big Five treatment. We can talk about individual differences and what happens in the bystander effect. Is it absolutely true that every single bystander will not do anything? No, sometimes there are bystanders that jump in. And so we need to be able to accommodate that there are differences that can emerge. And so I found this cute cartoon that illustrates the different roles that people might take in bullying. Bullying is an important topic for our students because the vast majority of them have had experiences with bullying, and that can be an easy way to talk about social psychology principles. Well, let's go to C. This one I borrow from Nin Nguyen Littleford, who said, if you can come up with a circumstance that's not real, but ask students to imagine what would happen if it were, then in fact, you can have a very interesting discussion that pulls in psychological, biological, social, and cultural factors. And so the example that I offer you here, besides that's a really beautiful tattoo. By the way, I'd never get one. I'm of that age where, no, thank you. I've got enough to contend with the skin that I have. Thank you very much. What if everyone got a tattoo? What consequences would that have? The conversation about that is fascinating. Because if tattoos are used to set yourself apart in some way, what function does that hold? That gives students who are of the pierced and inked clan, as I describe them in my classes, that is part of their identity. And the students who absolutely wouldn't do it, they have an opportunity to talk about what are the psych reasons, what are the biological reasons, and so on and so forth. But a good inspiration from Dr. Littleford. All right, this one, you will have a session, I believe it's next week, on looking at, or it might be in the third unit, in looking at the ways that IPI can contribute to what APA has embraced as an important objective, and that is being much more active in the promotion of social justice concerns with regard to reducing prejudice and promoting equity. Sue Boatwright Horowitz has developed a pre-post test measuring attitudes about racism, then uses the class to deal more specifically with a curriculum that looks at reducing prejudice and then measures a post-test to see if there have been actual changes made. Now, this topic we know is controversial. It probably is one of the outcomes that we debated the most heavily in the course of the conversations that we had, because we wanted to strike just the right non-accusatory, non-divisive stance to be able to support, yes, this is an important outcome, but can we do it in a way that allows everyone to be in the conversation, and to do that in a way that doesn't generate more hostility and even more trouble. And so a simple pre-post test may be a useful thing to do. Some individuals have actually developed themed classes in intro that focus on social justice issues. That is very authentic to their way of being. That goes along with what Garth said earlier. But we do think, especially in the social chapter and probably in the intelligence and testing chapters, it is important to be able to deal with the impact of psychology on where we have ended up in diversity. And also, I implore you to make sure that you address what the hope is, that with good psychology, we can make improvements in this important area. Next up, a little Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. It's not denial. I'm just very selective about my reality. Our perceptions and biases filter the experiences that we have through an imperfect lens. As I mentioned before, the powerhouse hit for me in intro psych was defense mechanisms. That it isn't just that people are lying. It is that they are seeing the world as a way to reduce their anxiety. And that lends itself to some distortion. And so it's relatively easy to get students to reflect on situations where they were in an argument and they knew they were absolutely right, and then found out later that they weren't. And how did that happen? Well, it happens because we have some cognitive biases and some protective mechanisms that keep us from accepting blame and from generating more anxiety. So we see multiple places in an intro course where this can come to the fore, using a projective test stimulus. Now, it used to be in the good old days, thematic apperception tests were protected information, and now you can download them from the internet. So that protective device, I think, has faded for psychologists. But one of the things I do is I use an outmoded test called the Blackie Pictures, which illustrates a series of conflicts that a little black dog has that illustrates Freudian principles. It's totally absurd, but if you can show a picture, ask a student to tell a story about that, you can illustrate a variety of the biases that come through in this story. As well, you can teach them a little bit about Freudian psychology if you're still inclined to address Freud. Also a big point of contention right now in introductory psychology. By the way, I weigh in on, if lay individuals think Freud is the most famous psychologist, then we do an injustice by not helping students understand why that's the case. Okay, so another individual difference, imperfect lens filtering, is the implicit associations test. Relatively easy to have students pop onto the website for the IAT and take the test and be a little bit surprised about whatever protective lenses are there, but it also encourages a reflection on, is this a good design procedure? What do you think? Can you use your critical thinking to decide whether the conclusions being presented here have validity? Are they robust? Virtually any controversial topic can be used to show bias. But of course, in this day and age, we also have to be a little bit careful because of the level of vigilance in how quickly things can go awry. So if you take on a controversial topic in intro, it's really important that ahead of time, you specify, here's how we're going to argue. It's going to be done respectfully. We're not going to interrupt each other. We're not going to do it with raised voices, and no F-bombs. I like to say that in my class. No F-bombs. Save those for outside class. I'm working with you to be professional, so we're going to approach this like a professional discussion. That usually heads off problems. Okay, next. Apply psychological principles and in order to change lives, organizations, and communities. I mentioned to you earlier that I had a group that went to a child abuse agency and developed a curriculum. That was quite the learning experience for them because they had to learn about child abuse from the standpoint of the agency. They were stunned to find out the frequency of child abuse in the area that we live, pretty awful. But they also had an opportunity to brush up on their communication skills since they had to present to people that they didn't know. And it turned out they were able to apply principles in a way that the agency, in fact, found helpful. And they borrowed the curriculum materials after the fact. But it doesn't have to be necessarily a group project. It can be an individual choice. And in fact, a very popular choice in intro is to take on a personal improvement plan that moves you towards your better self. And if you're like me, I can always be better about drinking more water, for example. I would probably be better off if I learned to sleep more soundly. What kinds of things can we take on, and how would we manipulate the environment and measure the outcomes to demonstrate change? So doing a personal change project is a good idea. Probably a little dicey to do alcohol intake since we're talking about students for the most part who are under age 21, but limiting your time on social media. How do you reduce distractions so that you can, can you increase your study time? How can you outline a procedure? And if you're serious about it, go ahead and implement the procedure and report the results in a nice tidy graph. Look at how many outcomes that could involve. Okay, then next. Ethical principles guide psychology research and practice. Of course, you see here an image from the original Stanford Prison Study. And Stanford Prison Study has a way, it's a little bit like, is the horror character that keeps popping up after he dies. It's either Freddy or Mike Myers, I forget which one it is. But there's something about the Stanford Prison Study that every few years, it recycles and people get upset anew about what happened at Stanford with Zimbardo. The fact is, Zimbardo himself says he got swept away. That turned out to be the point of what he was doing, is that you can get swept away by what's going on and lose track of what your own moral standing is. So in the Stanford Prison Study, just as a reminder, students were recruited and supposedly randomly assigned. There's been some challenge about that, to play either the role of the guard or the prisoner. And it was intended to go for a couple of weeks. Students were going to earn credit for it, but it had to be called after just a few days because the social fabric broke down. People embraced their roles. For the prisoners, they embraced it in a negative way. For the guards, they embraced it in a behavior excess way. And I always like to give full credit to Christina Maslock, who was Zimbardo's graduate student at the time, who turned to Phil, seeing what was going on with his students, and said, "You must stop this." And to his credit, he listened to her and gives her credit publicly for being smarter than he was at that time. We know that there have been ethical problems in psychology, in medical treatment. We know that this is one of the reasons why psychology goes to so much trouble in investigating and updating the ethics code. And in fact, I think there's a revision initiative going on right now to make sure that the ethics code that exists for 2022 really reflects the nature of difficulties that psychologists, whether they're in education, in therapy, or in research, whatever their role is, that the ethics code addresses that. But I think it's especially important from the standpoint of helping people get away from the evilness of psychology, the manipulativeness of psychology, that students leave intro not with Milgram and Zimbardo as the first thing, the only thing they remember. We want them to be able to recognize that if they go see a therapist, the therapist is duty bound to maintain confidentiality. And if they don't, there are consequences. So we are suggesting that we figure out ways throughout the curriculum, both in research and when we're talking about treatment, to emphasize the positive side of ethics and perhaps get a little bit more away from the negative social psych manipulations that were done back in the 60s and 70s. All right. So with that, that is a quick tour of some strategies that we could use if what we're trying to do is address those outcomes in particular. Now, what we'll be doing a week from today is we'll be taking some strategies that you develop and we'll be generating some rubrics to help assess student performance. So that's what's looming for us. But what we're going to do at this point is we're going to move you into a new breakout room. Yes, and we'd love for you to go to the breakout room that you've been assigned to meet some new people. And we'd like you to haul out a description of the thing that you're most proud of as an active learning strategy. See if you can connect it to the IPI outcomes that we've identified, a comfortable fit, or, you know, it's always possible that you may have discovered a chink in the IPI armor. IPI will probably be revised in 10 years because APA does things that way. But for our purposes, what we want you to do is get some practice in retrofitting, or if you're brand new to this, what kind of things intrigue you? What do you think would be a useful thing, keeping in mind that question, what is it that you're teaching your students that they can't afford to miss? So we're going to send you away for a good discussion. We're going to have you go away for about 25 minutes and see what you can come up with. And then we'd like to have some bragging rights after. So if you can be prepared to share an example or two from your groups, that would be a great way to round out what we're talking about. For additional help, I can't speak highly enough about project assessment, and I particularly want to give public credit to the intrepid Martha Baino, who some of you may have had the pleasure of working with in the breakout session. Martha is the guardian angel of the Education Directorate, as far as I'm concerned. I think she and I have worked together on all of the assessment projects that I've been involved with, and she has yet to make a mistake. So there's something kind of magical about her. But when she took on the project assessment, my God, that was an enormous job, trying to figure out the right format, trying to figure out how to determine if things were empirically based. Martha deserves every bit of kudos, and I see Regan piling on here, as he should, because we all think the world of Martha. But I would encourage you to take a look at project assessment, and I suspect project assessment will be in for some reform as Guidelines 3.0 develops. So we'll be looking for more exercises, including things like you discussed in your group. The other bullet point on this slide I just want to mention is something that I think Regan talked about in the beginning, is that way back in 1981, when I started teaching, I was desperate for ideas. How do I make the content more meaningful? How do I help it stick? And there wasn't much there. And so that inspired psychology teachers to get together, to have regional teaching conferences, to meet at APA, to go to the annual conference on teaching, where you see a generosity of spirit. You know, if I can teach it, you can steal it. You know, this is the attitude that you'll find in among this community. And so at this point, we have an abundance of things out there. So now we have the opposite problem. There is so much out there that it's relatively easy to get overwhelmed. So if I were to make a suggestion, start small, figure out a theme that you want to work with, figure out an outcome. Don't try to do everything all at once. And I think in the long run, once you embrace assessment as a lifestyle, it'll become easier to think in terms of how expansive you want to be without it making you crazy. Now, Dawn is asking a question, is it appropriate to share outcomes with students? You betcha. We organized and wrote those outcomes to be student friendly. We think that is one of the things that transpires in good rubric design. That's the topic that we'll be talking about shortly. So let me get to that next one. What we'll be doing next week, I have the first two sessions, and then we move to some other assessment experts that will be taking over to give you more examples. In session one, we're going to be talking about why it's helpful to use rubrics, that it isn't a rinky-tink thing that kids should do in high school. It is, in fact, a really helpful way to demystify what it is we're asking our students to do. So we'll spend some time on rubric development. And then in session two, we'll try to bring it all together, at least from my input, to help you draft what I'm calling the tentative transformation plan. Because I know the other people that you're going to be listening to will be able to give you some inspiration that will help you round out and confirm, here's my plan. Here's what I want to do to make this the most meaningful experience possible for students. And so with that, oh, and Dawn, thank you. I put SLOs in my syllabus and I use them in class nearly every class period. And, I use SLOs as a final exam often. I'll just say, okay, now go to the SLO list and tell me what you did that proves you did what I asked you to do. And students, again, find that something that helps them remember long term. So with that, I'm going to thank you very much for staying the course all the way through. And for those of you who are watching this on recording, thanks for coming back to do that. And I'll look forward to working with everybody again next Wednesday. We'll see you then.